The wind moves across the northern Mesopotamian plain with a patience that feels almost deliberate, as if it has been rehearsing this same motion for thousands of years. Sand shifts over broken stone walls buried so deep that even the idea of a city once standing here seems unreasonable. At first glance, the landscape offers nothing but heat, silence, and distance. Yet beneath that quiet surface, something ancient is still pressing upward, waiting for the moment when human hands will finally disturb what time tried to erase. It begins, as it often does, with an excavation that was not supposed to reveal anything extraordinary. A team working near an unremarkable rise in the soil, cataloguing layers of earth that seem no different from countless other sites across the region. The assumption is simple: another small settlement, another minor outpost from a known kingdom, another fragment to fill a predictable gap in the historical map. But archaeology rarely respects expectation for long. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The first clue is not dramatic. It is a fragment of clay, no larger than a human palm, bearing faint impressions that only become meaningful after careful cleaning. The markings are not immediately readable in the usual sense. They belong to a script, but not one that fits neatly into the known administrative languages of the surrounding empires. It is organized, deliberate, and strangely consistent, suggesting a bureaucratic system far more complex than the site's modest surface structures would imply. Then comes another fragment, and another. Soon the ground begins to yield pieces of what appears to be a buried archive, not scattered by accident, but deliberately stored and lost in place. The architecture that emerges alongside it does not match nearby civilizations in any simple way. The masonry is different, the urban planning subtly unfamiliar, and the artifacts suggest a culture that once operated at a scale far beyond what later historical records admit. What makes this discovery unsettling is not just its age, but its absence from memory. Civilizations of similar sophistication are usually well represented in the surviving records of their neighbours. They are recorded in trade documents, military accounts, diplomatic correspondence. Yet here, there is a growing sense that an entire political entity may have existed in the same crowded ancient world and then simply vanished from the narrative. This is where the idea of a forgotten superpower begins to take shape. Not a myth, not a legend passed down in oral tradition, but a structured, bureaucratic civilization with administrative language, economic records, and signs of regional influence. A civilization that once interacted with major powers of the Bronze Age world, yet left behind only fragmented echoes. Scholars working in the region begin to connect the material evidence with scattered references found in Egyptian inscriptions, Hittite archives, and Mesopotamian correspondence. These references do not align perfectly, but they point toward a powerful state situated in northern Mesopotamia and parts of modern-day Syria and Turkey. A kingdom that once controlled trade routes, influenced diplomacy, and maintained a military presence strong enough to be acknowledged by Egypt itself. And yet, its name is faint in comparison to its apparent scale. Modern scholarship has often focused on empires like Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria because their records survived in abundance. But here, something different is unfolding. The emerging picture suggests a civilization that was once equal in strength to those well-known powers, but whose historical footprint was deliberately reduced, fragmented, or overwritten by later dominance shifts in the region. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the silence surrounding it. The site continues to reveal more as excavation expands. Storage rooms appear, filled with broken seals and administrative tokens that suggest centralized governance. Remains of burned structures indicate episodes of destruction, though whether these were caused by warfare, internal collapse, or environmental stress remains uncertain. What survives in the record suggests a society that was highly organized but ultimately vulnerable to disruption on a large scale. In nearby layers, researchers find signs of abrupt abandonment. Everyday objects remain in place as if life stopped suddenly rather than gradually fading. Cooking vessels still sit near hearths. Tools lie unfinished. In some rooms, clay tablets appear to have been left mid-production, as though scribes were interrupted by something urgent enough to prevent their return. This pattern is not unique to a single location. Similar anomalies begin to appear across a broader geographic region, hinting at a coordinated cultural sphere rather than an isolated settlement. The realization slowly forms that what is being uncovered is not just a lost city, but the edge of something much larger that once held regional influence across multiple urban centers. The question that naturally follows is why such a civilization disappeared so thoroughly from historical memory. In the ancient world, even collapsed empires tend to leave traces in the records of others. Conquerors record victories, neighbors record trade, and enemies record conflicts. But here, the silence is unusually dense. It is as if later powers had either no interest in preserving its name, or actively allowed it to fade from collective record. Some scholars suggest that later imperial expansions may have absorbed or overwritten its identity, especially as dominant states reshaped political memory to strengthen their own legitimacy. Others point to the possibility of rapid collapse followed by population dispersal, where surviving groups merged into surrounding cultures, leaving no distinct continuity of identity. There are also more speculative theories, but those remain outside the boundaries of reliable evidence. What is not in dispute is that the archaeological layers beneath this site are revealing a civilization that does not fit comfortably within established historical frameworks. It existed, it functioned at scale, and it interacted with the ancient world's major powers, yet its name, its story, and its ultimate fate remain partially obscured, as if the historical record itself has been selectively stripped. As the excavation continues, the sense grows that this is only the beginning. The clay fragments, the buried architecture, and the fragmented inscriptions are not isolated curiosities. They are pieces of a larger structure that once shaped the political and economic balance of the ancient Near East, a structure that collapsed, disappeared, and was slowly forgotten until the Earth itself began to return it to the surface. And somewhere beneath the layers still untouched, more of its story waits, sealed in silence, waiting for the moment it is finally brought back into view. Long before the buried fragments were ever disturbed, the world that produced them was already deeply interconnected in ways that modern imagination often underestimates. The Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated kingdoms scattered across barren distance, but a tightly woven system of trade, diplomacy, warfare, and cultural exchange stretching from the Nile Valley to the edges of the Iranian plateau. Within this network, information moved slowly, but it moved reliably enough that distant courts were rarely unaware of one another's rise or decline. In this wider system, the existence of a powerful but poorly recorded civilization becomes less surprising, yet more difficult to explain in terms of historical silence. Egypt, for example, documented foreign powers with careful attention when they posed strategic importance. The Hittites left extensive diplomatic archives that recorded alliances and conflicts in detail. Mesopotamian cities preserved economic records that referenced neighbouring regions with meticulous precision. Against this backdrop of documentation, the absence of a clearly defined identity for a major northern power stands out sharply. Archaeologists studying the emerging evidence begin by placing the unknown civilization within this broader Bronze Age framework. The goal is not only to identify what it was, but to understand how it functioned among its peers. What becomes clear is that this was not a marginal society living at the edges of civilization. The scale of its urban remains, the sophistication of its administrative tools, and the reach implied by its artifacts all suggest a power operating at a level comparable to the great states of the period. The landscape it occupied was strategically significant. Northern Mesopotamia and adjacent regions served as a crossroads between Anatolia, the Levant, and the upper river systems feeding into the Tigris and Euphrates. Control of this region meant influence over trade routes carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from distant Central Asian networks, and agricultural surplus moving between river valleys. Any state able to stabilise and regulate this flow of goods would naturally accumulate wealth and political leverage far beyond its immediate borders. Evidence from excavated storage sites suggests that this unknown power did precisely that. Standardised weights appear across multiple locations, indicating a coordinated economic system. Seals used for trade documentation show recurring motifs, implying centralised administrative authority. Even more striking is the consistency of architectural planning in urban centres separated by considerable distance, suggesting either direct governance or a strong cultural framework that enforced uniformity. This level of organisation points toward a civilization that was not merely participating in Bronze Age exchange systems, but actively shaping them. Some scholars cautiously suggest that it may have functioned as a stabilising hub within regional trade, balancing competing interests between larger empires. Others propose that it operated as a territorial empire in its own right, with provinces extending across valleys and highlands that later became fragmented under successive invasions. Yet the paradox remains. If such a power existed at this scale, why does it not occupy a clearer position in historical memory? One possible explanation lies in the nature of ancient record preservation. Political narratives in the ancient world were often controlled by successor states. When a new power rose, it frequently absorbed, reinterpreted, or erased the achievements of its predecessors. In some cases, entire dynasties were reframed as tributary states or regional governors under later empires. This process of historical restructuring means that what survives in written record is not always a neutral reflection of past reality. Another factor may be the fragility of northern Mesopotamian archives. Unlike Egypt, where dry conditions preserved papyrus and inscriptions, much of the northern region relied heavily on clay tablets stored in buildings vulnerable to fire and collapse. Ironically, fire often preserves clay tablets by baking them, but complete destruction of administrative centres could still eliminate entire archives if sites were never excavated or were repeatedly rebuilt over. There is also the possibility of cultural assimilation. If the population of this superpower was absorbed into neighbouring societies after political collapse, its identity could have dissolved gradually rather than disappearing in a single catastrophic moment. Languages merge, administrative systems are replaced, and over generations, distinct cultural markers can fade until only indirect traces remain. Still, none of these explanations fully resolves the scale of absence. The archaeological record suggests not a minor regional state, but a system large enough to leave stronger echoes in surrounding civilizations. This is where uncertainty deepens, and where scholarly caution becomes essential. The evidence is substantial, but incomplete, and interpretations remain provisional. As excavation expands across multiple sites, patterns begin to emerge that reinforce the idea of a coordinated civilization. Road systems linking urban centres show deliberate construction rather than organic growth. Fortified settlements appear at strategic intervals, suggesting defensive planning on a regional scale. Agricultural infrastructure indicates large-scale coordination of irrigation and land use. pointing to administrative oversight capable of managing environmental resources across varied terrain. Even cultural artifacts show surprising consistency. Pottery styles, religious symbols, and burial practices share core similarities despite geographic distance. This does not imply a rigid uniform culture, but rather a shared identity framework strong enough to persist across regions, even as local variations developed. Such cohesion is typically associated with imperial structures or deeply integrated trade federations. What complicates the picture further is the presence of abrupt discontinuities in the archaeological layers. In some regions, settlements associated with this civilization appear to vanish without gradual transition. In others, they are replaced by materially different cultures within a relatively short time frame. These shifts suggest periods of instability that may have been rapid, even violent, though the exact causes remain debated. Scholars examining climate data from the broader Bronze Age period note that environmental fluctuations were occurring across the Near East during the late 2nd millennium BCE. Drought cycles, changes in river flow, and regional cooling events have all been proposed as contributing factors to widespread societal stress. While no single climatic event can be definitively linked to this civilization's decline, environmental pressure likely played some role in destabilizing existing systems. At the same time, external political pressures cannot be ignored. The expansion of neighboring empires created shifting boundaries and intensified competition for resources. Migration movements introduced new populations into established territories, sometimes peacefully, sometimes through conflict. These dynamics would have placed additional strain on any centralized system trying to maintain cohesion across a large and diverse region. What emerges from this broader Bronze Age context is a picture of a civilization deeply embedded in a volatile world system. It was not isolated, nor was it immune to the pressures shaping its neighbours. Instead, it appears to have been an active participant in a complex network of exchange and conflict, one that required constant adaptation to survive. And yet, despite its apparent strength and integration, it still disappears from clear historical view, not in a way that suggests simple decline, but in a manner that suggests fragmentation, absorption, and selective forgetting. The Bronze Age world moves on, its records dominated by a few surviving powers, while others fade into ambiguity. Beneath this historical silence, the fragments continue to accumulate, each one reinforcing the same unsettling possibility that what is being uncovered is not just a forgotten kingdom, but a civilization once significant enough to shape its world, now surviving only in scattered material traces waiting to be reassembled. The first outlines of a forgotten superpower do not appear as a single clear revelation, but as a slow convergence of fragments that refuse to stay isolated. A seal impression found in one valley resembles markings from a distant site hundreds of kilometers away. A broken administrative tablet mirrors accounting styles seen in an entirely different excavation zone. Even the architectural rhythm of certain ruins begins to echo itself across regions that were once assumed to belong to unrelated cultures. At first, these similarities are treated as coincidence, then they become patterns, and finally, patterns begin to feel like evidence of something larger that was never properly named. What begins to emerge is a civilization that did not announce itself in the historical record with the clarity of Egypt or Babylon, but instead spread through influence, infrastructure, and administrative consistency across a wide geographic arc. Its origins are still debated, but most reconstructions place its early development in the fertile corridors of northern Mesopotamia and the upper Euphrates basin, where rivers, trade routes, and agricultural surplus created the conditions for rapid political consolidation. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, in its earliest detectable phase, the civilization appears fragmented, composed of semi-independent city-states bound together by shared economic systems rather than rigid political unity. Evidence from early seals suggests competing local authorities using similar administrative languages, implying either a shared cultural foundation or the presence of a dominant organizing center, exerting influence over multiple settlements. This is the first hint that the civilization may not have formed through conquest alone, but through a gradual process of integration driven by trade and bureaucratic standardization. Over time, that loose network begins to tighten. Urban centers show increasing architectural uniformity. Public buildings adopt similar layouts, with centralized storage facilities, administrative quarters, and fortified compounds appearing in consistent arrangements. This kind of planning does not emerge spontaneously across unrelated societies. It suggests coordination, communication, and a shared understanding of governance that extends beyond local tradition. One of the most revealing aspects of this early formation is the standardization of measurement systems. Weights and measures recovered from different sites match within narrow tolerances, indicating a regulated economic framework. Such systems are rarely accidental. They require enforcement, oversight, and a degree of political stability strong enough to maintain consistency across distance and time. This alone implies a governing structure more sophisticated than what earlier assumptions had allowed. As the civilization grows, its influence begins to extend outward into neighboring regions. Trade goods associated with its material culture appear in distant markets. Pottery styles and metalworking techniques begin to circulate beyond their original zones. In some areas, local traditions adapt these influences, blending them into hybrid cultural forms. In others, the presence is more direct, suggesting administrative or military presence rather than passive exchange. Yet despite this expansion, the civilization remains curiously underrepresented in written histories from its contemporaries. Egyptian records mention foreign polities to the north, but descriptions are often vague or fragmented. Hittite archives reference shifting alliances and conflicts in regions that align geographically with the emerging superpower, but names vary and identities are inconsistent. Mesopotamian texts occasionally refer to powerful northern entities, but these references are often obscured by translation ambiguity or damaged tablets. This inconsistency has led scholars to propose that the civilization may have been known by multiple names depending on context, language, and political perspective. What one city described as a trade partner, another may have recorded as a tributary state or rival power. Over time, these overlapping identities could have fragmented the historical memory, making it difficult for later historians to reconstruct a unified narrative. Archaeological evidence supports the idea of a civilization that was both expansive and adaptable. In some regions, its presence is marked by large urban centres with clear administrative hierarchy. In others, it appears as a lighter footprint standardised goods, shared technologies, and cultural influence without direct urban dominance. This duality suggests a flexible model of expansion, one that combined centralised authority with regional autonomy. Such a system would have been highly effective in the volatile Bronze Age environment, where rigid empires often struggled to maintain control over distant territories. By contrast, a networked superpower could maintain cohesion through economic dependence, cultural integration, and administrative standardization, rather than direct military occupation alone. This might explain how it achieved such wide influence without leaving the kind of monumental political footprint seen in Egypt or Assyria. However, this flexibility also introduces vulnerability. Systems built on interdependence are sensitive to disruption. If trade routes are interrupted, if regional hubs collapse, or if environmental stress reduces agricultural output, the entire network can begin to fragment rapidly. Evidence from later layers suggests precisely such a breakdown occurring in multiple regions simultaneously, though the causes remain debated. One of the most intriguing discoveries supporting this model comes from a cluster of administrative tablets found in what appears to be a regional distribution centre. The records show meticulous tracking of goods moving between cities, including grain, textiles, metals, and livestock. What stands out is the level of coordination required to maintain such records across multiple jurisdictions. This is not the documentation of a small kingdom. It reflects the complexity of a system managing resources at a scale comparable to known empires of the period. Yet even here, the identity of the central authority remains elusive. The tablets refer to administrative titles and institutional roles, but personal names and dynastic references are scarce. This absence makes it difficult to reconstruct a clear political lineage. It is as if the civilization defined itself more through function than through individual rulers, or perhaps its records were later damaged, rewritten, or selectively preserved. Environmental evidence adds another layer of complexity. Soil cores and climate reconstructions suggest periods of alternating stability and stress during the civilization's expansion phase. Extended dry spells may have forced agricultural adjustments, while sudden climatic shifts could have disrupted river systems critical for transport and irrigation. These pressures would have required strong administrative coordination to manage effectively, reinforcing the idea of a highly organized governing structure. At the same time, evidence of fortification expansion in certain regions suggests that external pressures were increasing. Defensive structures appear more frequently along frontier zones, indicating either rising conflict with neighbouring states or internal instability that required containment. The relationship between expansion and insecurity becomes increasingly intertwined, hinting that the civilization's growth may have carried within it the seeds of later fragmentation. What remains particularly striking is the absence of a singular defining moment of emergence. Unlike civilizations that appear suddenly in the historical record with clear founding dynasties, this superpower seems to have coalesced gradually from overlapping systems of trade, governance, and cultural exchange. Its rise is not marked by a dramatic beginning, but by accumulation, integration, and the slow consolidation of power across regions that were once independent. And because of this gradual formation, its identity becomes harder to isolate in hindsight. Later civilizations, encountering only fragments of its former presence, may have struggled to recognize it as a unified entity. Instead, they may have seen only pieces: a trade partner here, a rival city there, a cultural influence in another place. Over time, these fragments could easily dissolve into the background noise of history. Yet beneath that fragmentation, the material record continues to suggest coherence. The same administrative logic, the same architectural principles, the same economic systems repeated across distance and time. These are not random similarities. They are the imprint of a civilization that once operated at scale, shaping the world around it in ways that were both visible and, ultimately, transient. As excavation continues and more sites are linked together, the outline of this forgotten superpower becomes clearer, but also more complex. It was not simply a kingdom that rose and fell. It was a system, a network, and a political organism whose influence extended far beyond what its surviving name, or lack of name, would suggest. And somewhere in the layer still buried, the next stage of its story waits, where expansion gives way to strain, and stability begins to fracture under pressures that are only now being reconstructed from the silence it left behind. The landscape changes before collapse ever becomes visible in the record. Rivers that once carried steady seasonal flow begin to shift their rhythms in ways that would have been subtle to the people living through them, but unmistakable in hindsight. Rainfall patterns weaken across certain corridors, while other regions experience irregular bursts that disrupt planting cycles rather than supporting them. For a civilization built on coordination across distant agricultural zones, these shifts do not immediately signal disaster, but they begin to strain the invisible systems that hold everything together. In the cities of this forgotten superpower, storage facilities grow more heavily used. Administrative tablets begin to reflect increasing attention to rationing, redistribution, and contingency planning. At first glance, the bureaucracy appears as efficient as ever, possibly even more refined than in earlier phases. Yet beneath that surface of order lies an important change. The system is no longer simply managing growth, but trying to stabilize pressure. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. One of the most revealing aspects of this phase is how little dramatic change appears at first in the material culture. Pottery styles remain consistent. Architectural forms continue without abrupt transformation. Even religious iconography shows continuity. This creates a deceptive impression of stability, but administrative records tell a different story. Grain allocations fluctuate more sharply between regions. Transportation records show longer delays. Emergency distributions appear with increasing frequency. The civilization still functions, but it is now functioning under strain. What makes this particularly significant is that this strain is not localized. It appears across multiple urban centers separated by considerable distance. This suggests a systemic pressure rather than isolated mismanagement. Scholars examining this pattern often point toward environmental stress as a likely contributing factor, though no single climatic event has been identified that fully accounts for the scale of disruption implied by the evidence. What survives in the record suggests a combination of gradual environmental change and increasing social complexity pushing against the limits of coordination. In agricultural zones, pollen data and sediment cores indicate shifts in crop composition. Communities that once relied on stable cereal production begin to diversify more aggressively, suggesting attempts to adapt to declining yields or inconsistent seasonal cycles. This kind of adaptation is not unusual in ancient societies, but its widespread appearance across multiple regions at the same time suggests coordinated response rather than isolated experimentation. At the same time, evidence of infrastructure maintenance increases, irrigation channels are repaired more frequently, storage systems are expanded or reorganized. Roads connecting key urban centers show signs of repeated reinforcement. These patterns suggest a state attempting to preserve connectivity at all costs. In a networked civilization, maintaining flow of goods, information, and resources is more important than expansion. Once flow begins to slow, the entire system becomes vulnerable. Yet even as these efforts intensify, subtle signs of fragmentation begin to appear. Some regions show slight deviations in administrative formatting. Seal impressions begin to vary more than in earlier periods, suggesting either decentralization or weakening central oversight. In certain sites, foreign material culture begins to appear more frequently, indicating increased contact with outside groups or internal cultural blending under pressure. This is where migration dynamics begin to play a more visible role. Neighbouring populations, responding to their own environmental or political pressures, begin moving through border regions. Some movements are gradual, involving trade and settlement over time. Others appear more abrupt, possibly linked to conflict or resource scarcity. For a civilization already managing internal strain, these external pressures add another layer of complexity that must be absorbed without breaking the system. Fortified settlements become more prominent along key routes. Defensive architecture expands not only at borders but also around critical administrative and storage centres. This suggests a shift in perception. Stability is no longer assumed, but actively defended. The presence of such fortifications does not necessarily indicate constant warfare, but it does reflect a growing awareness of vulnerability. Interestingly, despite these signs of stress, there is no immediate evidence of widespread panic or cultural collapse during this phase. Religious and cultural continuity remains strong. Ritual practices continue with little interruption. Burial traditions maintain established forms. This points to a society still confident in its identity, even as its structural systems begin to weaken. Civilizations often persist culturally long after their administrative coherence begins to erode. One of the more intriguing discoveries from this period comes from a set of correspondence tablets recovered from what appears to be a mid-level administrative hub. These documents do not describe catastrophe. Instead, they describe coordination efforts, redistribution schedules, requests for surplus grain, and logistical adjustments between regions. What stands out is the increasing complexity of these communications, as if the system is working harder to maintain equilibrium against growing instability. At certain points, the tone of these records shifts subtly, not toward collapse, but toward urgency. Delays are noted more frequently, shortages are acknowledged in more regions. There are references to adjustments and expectation, a phrase that suggests normalization of reduced abundance. This is not yet breakdown, but it is adaptation under constraint. Meanwhile, in peripheral regions, archaeological layers begin to show signs of localized disruption. Some settlements appear to shrink in size, others are abandoned and then partially reoccupied. Material culture becomes more heterogeneous, suggesting increased interaction with outside groups or internal population movement. These patterns are consistent with societies experiencing both environmental pressure and shifting political stability. The key question is why these pressures do not immediately lead to visible fragmentation at the centre. One explanation lies in administrative resilience. Highly structured systems can absorb shocks for extended periods by reallocating resources and adjusting expectations. Another possibility is that the civilization's core regions were more stable than its peripheries, masking the severity of conditions in outer zones. But there is also the possibility that the system itself was becoming increasingly dependent on continuous expansion and connectivity. In such a model, stability is not static. It is maintained through constant movement of resources and information. When that movement slows, even slightly, the effects accumulate across time rather than appearing as immediate collapse. This kind of vulnerability is difficult to perceive until it reaches a tipping point. Environmental reconstructions from this period continue to suggest variability rather than a single catastrophic event. Some regions show extended drought signals, while others show irregular flooding patterns. This uneven distribution of stress would have made centralized planning increasingly difficult, requiring constant recalibration of agricultural and economic strategies. Over time, such recalibration becomes exhausting for any administrative system, no matter how advanced. And yet, despite all these pressures, there is still no clear indication of imminent collapse. Instead, what emerges is a civilization in motion, adjusting, adapting, and attempting to preserve coherence across a widening range of challenges. It is not a story of sudden failure, but of gradual imbalance accumulating across systems that once appeared almost self-sustaining. As later layers will reveal, this phase of strain is not the end, but the beginning of a more decisive transformation. The systems that once held this superpower together are still functioning, but they are no longer operating under conditions of stability. They are operating under conditions of endurance, and endurance, in the ancient world as in any system, has limits that are not always visible until they are crossed. The first signs that something has shifted beyond recovery do not arrive as a single event, but as a widening pattern of disruption that begins at the edges of the civilization and slowly moves inward. In the frontier cities, where administrative control is already stretched thin, settlement layers show abrupt breaks. Houses are abandoned without clear rebuilding phases. Storage facilities are left partially emptied. Roads that once carried steady trade begin to fall into irregular use. Then into silence. Yet in the central regions, the picture still appears deceptively stable. Palaces continue functioning. Administrative archives are still being updated. Religious rituals proceed with familiar precision. This contrast creates a dangerous illusion of control. The core believes it is managing instability at the margins, while in reality the margins are no longer feeding the core with the same reliability as before. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, one of the most important developments during this phase is the breakdown of synchronization across the networked system. Earlier in its history, this civilization depended on tightly coordinated flows of goods, labor, and information. Grain moved from surplus zones to deficit zones, metal resources travelled along established corridors, administrative instructions flowed outward from central hubs with predictable regularity. But now, those flows begin to slow, distort, and in some cases stop entirely. Archaeological evidence from distribution centres reveals growing inconsistencies in record keeping. Some tablets show delayed entries, others show duplicated transactions. In a few cases, records appear to have been corrected multiple times, suggesting confusion or rapid changes in policy. This does not indicate collapse in a dramatic sense, but it does suggest a system under increasing cognitive and logistical strain. At the same time, material culture begins to diverge more noticeably between regions. Pottery styles, once relatively standardized, start to vary in shape and decoration. Metalwork techniques show localized adaptation rather than centralized consistency. Even seal designs, which previously followed recognizable patterns across vast distances, begin to fragment into regional variations. This is one of the clearest indicators that central authority is weakening, even if it has not yet disappeared. What makes this phase particularly significant is that it does not resemble a sudden invasion or external conquest. There is no clear evidence of a single destructive force sweeping across the region at this moment. Instead, what appears is a slow unravelling of cohesion, where the system begins to behave less like a unified structure and more like a collection of semi-independent units drifting apart under pressure. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of political decentralization. Regional governors or local elites may have begun asserting greater autonomy as central coordination weakened. Others suggest that communication delays alone could have triggered cascading inefficiencies, making centralized governance increasingly impractical over long distances. In either case, the result is the same: the system becomes less synchronized and more fragmented. In agricultural zones, the effects of this fragmentation are immediate and severe. Irrigation systems that once depended on coordinated maintenance begin to fail in parts. Canals silt up in some regions while others are overused beyond capacity. This uneven degradation creates localized food shortages, which then ripple outward as trade networks struggle to compensate. The careful balance that once supported large urban populations begins to destabilize. Human movement responds quickly to these changes. Archaeological layers show increasing evidence of population displacement. Smaller settlements shrink or disappear, while larger urban centers experience fluctuating population densities. Some regions show signs of temporary overcrowding, followed by rapid decline. These patterns suggest not a single mass migration, but multiple overlapping waves of movement driven by localized failure points. One of the more subtle but important indicators of systemic stress is the changing nature of construction activity. In earlier phases, building projects were large-scale, standardized, and centrally organized. During this transitional period, construction becomes smaller, more improvised, and increasingly focused on repair rather than expansion. Walls are reinforced rather than extended. Existing structures are reused rather than replaced. This reflects a shift from growth-oriented planning to maintenance under constraint. At the same time, evidence of conflict becomes more frequent, though not always large-scale. Fortifications show signs of repair and reinforcement. Some sites contain weapon deposits that suggest heightened defensive readiness. However, there is no clear evidence of sustained, empire-wide warfare during this specific phase. Instead, the evidence points toward localized conflicts, possibly over resources, territory, or control of remaining trade routes. The breakdown of long-distance trade is particularly significant. Materials that once moved freely across the civilization begin to appear less frequently in distant regions. Tin, copper, and luxury goods become scarcer in certain archaeological contexts, suggesting that long-standing trade networks are either disrupted or rerouted through smaller, less efficient channels. This would have had cascading effects on metallurgy, craftsmanship, and administrative supply chains. In administrative centres, the tone of records begins to shift again. Earlier references to adjustment and coordination give way to more direct acknowledgements of difficulty. Shortages are more explicitly recorded. Requests for assistance become more frequent and less certain of fulfillment. In some cases, documents appear to record expectations that cannot be met, suggesting a gap between administrative intention and material reality. Despite these signs, there is still no singular moment of collapse. Instead, the system continues to operate in a degraded state, attempting to maintain functionality while losing the conditions that made its earlier stability possible. This is one of the most important characteristics of complex civilizations. They rarely fall all at once. They weaken unevenly, with different regions experiencing failure at different times and intensities. Environmental factors likely continue to play a role in this process. Climatic reconstructions suggest ongoing variability in rainfall and temperature patterns. While not catastrophic in isolation, these fluctuations would have compounded existing logistical difficulties. Agriculture becomes less predictable. River systems become less reliable. Storage and redistribution systems, already under strain, must now compensate for environmental uncertainty as well as political fragmentation. It is during this phase that migration pressure becomes more pronounced. Groups from surrounding regions move into areas once controlled by the civilization, sometimes peacefully integrating, sometimes displacing existing populations. These movements are not necessarily coordinated invasions. More often, they appear as gradual infiltration driven by broader regional instability. Over time, however, their cumulative effect is transformative. The interaction between incoming populations and existing structures creates hybrid cultural zones. Material culture in these areas becomes mixed, reflecting adaptation rather than replacement. However, this blending also makes it more difficult to trace the original identity of the civilization in later archaeological layers. What was once a relatively coherent cultural system begins to dissolve into overlapping traditions. By the end of this phase, the civilization is no longer functioning as a unified system in any meaningful sense. It still exists in fragments, with some regions maintaining administrative continuity longer than others, but the network that once connected them has largely disintegrated. Communication slows, trade weakens, authority becomes localized. And yet, even at this stage, there is no clear historical narrative of what has happened. No single account describes the full scope of the transformation. Instead, what survives are partial records from different regions, each capturing only a piece of the larger process. Some describe shortages, others describe conflict, others still describe routine administration continuing as if nothing fundamental had changed. This fragmentation of evidence is one of the reasons the civilization remains so difficult to reconstruct. It did not disappear in a way that produced a unified story. It dissolved across space and time, leaving behind isolated snapshots rather than a continuous narrative. What remains consistent, however, is the underlying pattern of a once integrated system losing coherence under the combined pressures of environmental variability, administrative strain, and regional fragmentation. The civilization is not yet gone, but it is no longer whole, and in the next stage of its history, even these fragments will begin to fall silent. There is a moment in the life cycle of every complex civilization when decline stops looking like decline and starts looking like absence forming in real time. In the ruins of this forgotten superpower, that moment is preserved not in a single destruction layer but in a thinning of continuity. Streets that once carried constant movement begin to show gaps in use. Administrative centres still stand, but their rhythm changes, as if the system inside them is no longer fully synchronized with the world outside. At first, the change is almost invisible. A few empty storerooms in one district, a delay in correspondence in another, a regional centre that no longer receives shipments on the expected cycle. Each instance is explainable on its own, but together they form a pattern that no longer resembles temporary disruption. It resembles disconnection. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, one of the most striking aspects of this phase is how much of the civilization continues to function outwardly. Temples still operate. Local administrators still issue directives. Some cities still show signs of active governance, but the network that once bound these units into a coherent whole is no longer reliably visible in the archaeological record. It is as if the nervous system of the civilization has begun to fail while the limbs continue to move independently for a time. This phenomenon is visible in the distribution of administrative tablets. In earlier phases, documents appear in coordinated clusters, often reflecting synchronized accounting periods across multiple regions. Now, those clusters become irregular. Some regions produce dense administrative records while others produce almost none. The absence is not random. It reflects breakdown in communication channels, delays in transmission, and likely the gradual loss of central oversight. In economic terms, the effects are immediate. Trade becomes increasingly localized. Long-distance exchange, once the defining strength of this superpower, contracts sharply. Goods that once moved seamlessly across vast distances now circulate only within regional boundaries. This contraction is visible in the material record: fewer foreign materials in elite contexts, fewer standardized goods in peripheral settlements, and a growing reliance on locally produced substitutes. Yet the civilization does not collapse in the way modern imagination might expect. There is no singular burning horizon, no unified destruction layer spanning the entire region. Instead, there is fragmentation. Some cities decline rapidly while others persist. Some administrative centres continue functioning long after surrounding settlements have faded. This uneven pattern is one of the most important clues to understanding the nature of its fall. Environmental data continues to support a background of instability. Pollen analysis and sediment cores suggest fluctuating agricultural conditions, but again, not a single catastrophic event. Instead, there is variability layered upon variability. One region experiences drought while another experiences flooding. One valley recovers while another collapses. For a system dependent on coordination, such uneven stress is far more destabilizing than uniform disaster. As communication weakens, regional autonomy increases by necessity rather than design. Local administrators begin making decisions without waiting for distant approval. Supply chains are reorganized at smaller scales. Urban centers adjust independently to local conditions. Over time, these adaptations become permanent structures rather than temporary responses. Authority, once centralized, becomes distributed almost by default. This decentralization leaves visible traces in the archaeological record. Seal impressions lose their uniformity. Administrative formulas diverge. Even weights and measures begin to vary subtly between regions that once adhered to strict standardization. These changes might seem minor individually, but collectively they represent the dissolution of shared systemic identity. One of the most revealing discoveries from this phase comes from what appears to be a former administrative archive that was never fully emptied. The tablets found here show a shift in tone and structure. Earlier documents are precise, formulaic, and confident in execution. Later ones become shorter, more fragmented, and increasingly concerned with uncertainty. Instructions reference missing shipments, unresponsive regions, and incomplete information. What is particularly telling is the absence of resolution in many of these records. Requests are recorded, but responses are missing. Plans are outlined, but outcomes are not documented. It is as if the system is still attempting to operate, but the feedback loop that once sustained it has broken down. In some urban centres, evidence suggests attempts at reorganisation. New storage systems are constructed, defensive structures are reinforced, administrative zones are redefined. These efforts indicate awareness of instability, but also highlight the difficulty of responding to systemic rather than localised failure. A civilization can repair infrastructure, but repairing coherence is far more complex. Migration continues to reshape the population landscape during this phase. Groups move into partially abandoned areas, repurposing existing structures. In some cases, they adopt elements of the existing administrative system. In others, they replace it entirely. This process accelerates cultural blending, but also contributes to the erasure of the civilization's distinct identity over time. Religious and ritual continuity, however, remains surprisingly persistent. Temples continue to function even as surrounding administrative systems weaken. This suggests that ideological and cultural structures outlast political and economic ones. In many ancient societies, religious institutions often serve as the last remaining stable frameworks during periods of collapse. But even these institutions are not immune to change. Over time, variations in ritual practice begin to appear between regions. Some traditions persist in altered form, others disappear entirely. This gradual divergence reflects the broader fragmentation of the civilization's shared identity. What is particularly important in this phase is the absence of dramatic collapse markers in many regions. Instead of sudden destruction, there is gradual abandonment. Buildings fall out of use, maintenance stops, occupation becomes intermittent, then rare. The archaeological signature is one of fading presence rather than violent termination. In some areas, however, there are signs of more abrupt disruption. Burn layers, collapsed structures, and hurried abandonment suggest localized crises. These may represent conflict, internal unrest, or sudden environmental shocks. But they are not consistent across the entire civilization. Instead, they appear as isolated events within a broader pattern of gradual decline. This unevenness complicates any attempt to define a single cause of collapse. There is no unified explanation that accounts for all regions simultaneously. Some areas show strong environmental stress, others show evidence of increased migration. Still others show administrative breakdown preceding material decline. The reality appears to be a convergence of multiple pressures rather than a single catastrophic trigger. As the system continues to fragment, the concept of central identity begins to dissolve. What once may have been recognized as a unified civilization becomes, in the archaeological record, a collection of related but increasingly distinct regional cultures. The shared administrative and economic frameworks that once bound them together no longer function as a cohesive system. Yet traces of that system remain embedded in the material record. Standardized technologies persist in modified form. Architectural traditions continue in regional variations. Even linguistic elements survive, though transformed through local adaptation. These remnants suggest not disappearance, but transformation under pressure. By the end of this phase, the civilization no longer exists as a functioning network. It exists instead as a scattering of remnants, each continuing independently, each carrying partial memory of a system that once connected them. The coherence is gone, but the fragments remain, and it is within these fragments that later archaeologists will begin, much later, to reconstruct the outline of something far larger than any single surviving settlement suggests. The climate does not collapse all at once. It shifts, slowly at first, in ways that are almost impossible to separate from normal seasonal variation. But within the administrative archives of this forgotten superpower, there is a quiet accumulation of signals that something fundamental is changing in the background systems that once supported its stability. Rivers that had followed predictable rhythms begin to fluctuate more sharply. Harvest reports become less uniform across regions. Storage calculations start to show increasing margins of error that no longer correct themselves over time. For a civilization built on coordination across distance, these are not just environmental changes. They are systemic stress tests that the system is no longer passing with confidence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, in the earliest phase of environmental disruption, the responses appear entirely rational. Agricultural adjustments are made, irrigation schedules are modified, trade routes are rerouted to compensate for local shortages. The administrative machine still functions with a level of sophistication that suggests confidence in its ability to manage instability. But what is missing is the assumption of predictability. The system is no longer correcting small deviations. It is reacting to continuous variability. This distinction matters more than it might first appear. In stable civilizations, uncertainty is typically episodic. A drought, a flood, a poor harvest season. These are events that can be absorbed and compensated for. But in this phase of the superpower's history, variability itself becomes the constant condition. The problem is no longer how to respond to a crisis, but how to govern under persistent unpredictability. Archaeological and environmental evidence suggests that rainfall patterns across the broader region become increasingly erratic. Some areas experience prolonged dry cycles, while others face sudden and intense flooding. River systems that once provided stable agricultural lifelines begin to shift course or reduce flow in ways that disrupt established settlement patterns. For a civilization dependent on large-scale coordination, this creates cascading effects across multiple sectors at once. In agricultural records recovered from administrative centres, there is a noticeable increase in contingency language. Terms associated with surplus and distribution begin to decline, while references to scarcity and adjustment become more frequent. What is particularly revealing is not just the presence of shortage, but the normalization of it. The system begins to assume that imbalance is expected rather than exceptional. At the same time, regional differentiation accelerates. Some areas adapt successfully to new environmental conditions, developing localized strategies that stabilize food production. Others struggle to maintain even basic agricultural output. This uneven resilience contributes directly to political fragmentation, as regions that can sustain themselves become less dependent on central coordination. The administrative structure attempts to respond, but its effectiveness is diminishing. Communication delays increase. Resource allocation becomes less precise. Some directives appear to arrive too late to be implemented effectively. Others seem to be ignored entirely, not necessarily out of rebellion, but because local conditions no longer align with centralized expectations. One of the most important archaeological indicators from this phase is the changing distribution of storage infrastructure. In earlier periods, large centralized granaries dominate the landscape, reflecting coordinated redistribution systems. In this later phase, storage becomes more localized. Smaller facilities appear within individual settlements, suggesting a shift toward regional self-reliance. This is a structural transformation that signals a breakdown in large-scale integration. Yet even as this decentralization occurs, there is evidence of continued effort to maintain cohesion. Some administrative centers expand their communication networks. Attempts are made to standardize reporting formats across regions. New systems of record-keeping are introduced, possibly in an effort to regain control over increasingly fragmented data. These measures indicate not abandonment of the system, but an attempt to preserve it under deteriorating conditions. At the same time, migration patterns become more pronounced. Environmental stress in surrounding regions drives population movements toward areas still capable of sustaining agriculture. This movement is not always organized or peaceful. Archaeological layers show increasing density in certain urban centers, followed by periods of rapid decline, suggesting cycles of overcrowding and resource strain. In some regions, this influx leads to cultural blending. New material styles appear alongside older traditions. Burial practices begin to vary more widely within the same geographic zones. This reflects not only migration, but also the weakening of cultural standardization that once defined the civilization's identity. It is important to note that none of this represents immediate collapse. The civilization still functions in many areas. Temples continue to operate, local governance persists, trade does not disappear entirely, but the coherence that once allowed these systems to operate as parts of a unified whole is increasingly absent. What remains is functionality without synchronization. Scholars examining this phase often emphasize the difference between system failure and system disintegration. Failure implies a point of breakdown. Disintegration describes a process in which parts continue to operate independently, while the connections between them dissolve. The evidence strongly suggests that what is occurring here is the latter. Environmental variability continues to intensify this process. Even modest fluctuations in rainfall or temperature have amplified consequences in a system that depends on precise coordination. Agricultural planning becomes more difficult. Surplus buffering becomes less reliable. This forces communities to prioritize short-term survival over long-term integration. In some areas, there is evidence of increasing fortification. Walls are strengthened, defensive structures are expanded. These changes do not necessarily indicate large-scale warfare, but they do reflect rising concern about resource security. In times of scarcity, competition often shifts from external enemies to neighbouring communities experiencing the same pressures. Despite these challenges, cultural continuity remains surprisingly resilient. Religious practices persist across regions, even as political and economic systems fragment. This suggests that identity, once established, can outlast the structures that created it. Ritual continuity becomes a stabilizing force in an otherwise destabilizing environment. However, even cultural systems begin to diverge over time. Regional variations in ritual practice increase. Symbolic representations evolve differently in different areas. Shared traditions begin to fragment into localized versions, each preserving elements of the original system but no longer maintaining uniformity across the entire civilization. By this stage, the superpower no longer exists as a unified entity in any functional sense. It persists as a network of partially connected regions, each adapting independently to local conditions. The administrative and economic systems that once bound these regions together are still present in fragments, but they no longer operate cohesively. What is particularly striking is the absence of a single defining moment that can be identified as the point of collapse. Instead, there is a long process of gradual separation, where connectivity weakens incrementally until the system no longer behaves as a single organism. This makes the decline difficult to perceive in real time and even harder to reconstruct in hindsight. Later archaeological interpretation relies heavily on this phase to understand the transformation from empire to fragmentation. It is here that the superpower effectively ceases to exist as a coherent structure, even though its individual components continue for some time afterward. And as environmental pressure continues, migration intensifies and administrative cohesion fades further. The system moves closer to a state where even its fragments will begin to lose their internal stability, setting the stage for the final breakdown that follows. The first movements of large-scale population pressure do not look like invasion at all. They look like accumulation. Settlements that once sat at the edges of the superpower sphere begin to swell gradually as people move inward from increasingly unstable surrounding regions. At first, these movements are seasonal, tied to agricultural cycles and local shortages, but over time, they become permanent. Entire communities relocate, bringing with them their own customs, tools, and survival strategies. What the archaeological record reveals in this phase is not a single wave of migration, but a sustained reshaping of demographic balance across the entire region. The frontier is no longer a boundary, it becomes a filter, and then a corridor. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Inside the remaining core regions of the civilization, this influx creates immediate strain. Urban centres that were already operating under reduced coordination now face unpredictable population growth. Housing density increases, water systems are stretched, food distribution networks, already weakened by environmental instability, struggle to accommodate the sudden and uneven demand. Yet the response is not immediate collapse. Instead, there is adaptation, improvisation, and localized reorganization. Some cities expand informal settlements on their outskirts. Others repurpose abandoned structures. Administrative records begin to reflect emergency measures that are reactive rather than strategic. This is a key shift. The system is no longer shaping its environment. It is reacting to it. One of the most significant archaeological indicators from this phase is the change in urban layering. Excavations show overlapping occupation phases within the same city zones, suggesting rapid cycles of abandonment and reoccupation. Streets that were once formally planned now evolve into irregular pathways shaped by necessity rather than design. Public buildings are subdivided or repurposed for multiple functions simultaneously. The original administrative logic of the city begins to dissolve under the pressure of survival. At the same time, external groups entering these regions are not culturally uniform. They bring different languages, technologies, and social structures. Some integrate into existing systems, adopting elements of the superpower's administrative framework. Others maintain distinct identities, forming parallel communities within the same urban space. This creates a complex mosaic of cultural interaction that further complicates governance. In earlier phases, the civilization maintained coherence through standardization. Shared systems of measurement, administration, and communication allowed distant regions to function as parts of a unified structure. In this phase, standardization begins to break down under demographic pressure. Local adaptations become necessary, and over time, they replace central uniformity. Administrative tablets from this period show increasing irregularity. Some documents are written in hybrid formats, combining older standardized systems with emerging local variations. Others show simplified record-keeping, possibly due to reduced training or loss of institutional knowledge. There is also evidence of administrative redundancy, where multiple overlapping authorities attempt to manage the same regions without clear coordination. This fragmentation of authority is particularly important. It suggests that governance itself is no longer centralized or even clearly hierarchical. Instead, multiple layers of control coexist, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, and often operating in parallel without effective integration. Environmental pressures continue to influence these dynamics. Regions experiencing agricultural decline become primary sources of migration, while more stable areas become focal points of population concentration. This uneven distribution creates cycles of pressure and relief that constantly reshape settlement patterns. No region remains stable for long enough to establish long-term equilibrium. In some areas, evidence suggests that local elites attempt to stabilize conditions by increasing fortifications and controlling access to resources. Storage facilities become more heavily guarded. Entry points into cities are more tightly regulated. These measures indicate growing concern over scarcity and security. However, they also reflect diminishing trust in broader systemic coordination. What is particularly notable is that despite increasing tension, there is little evidence of unified large-scale warfare during the early part of this phase. Instead, conflict appears fragmented and localized. Skirmishes over resources, disputes between neighboring communities, and offensive actions against migrating groups all contribute to a general atmosphere of instability without a single defining war. This type of fragmentation is often more destabilizing than organized conflict. In a structured war, systems can mobilize, adapt, and eventually recover. In fragmented pressure environments, stress is continuous, distributed, and unpredictable. It erodes coherence gradually rather than breaking it abruptly. Archaeological evidence also shows increasing reuse of older structures. Buildings from earlier phases are repurposed repeatedly, often without regard for their original function. Administrative spaces become residential areas. Storage facilities are converted into workshops or shelters. This reflects not only practical necessity but also the loss of long-term planning capacity. In some cases, construction quality declines noticeably. Materials are reused without refinement. Architectural precision gives way to expedience. This does not necessarily indicate cultural decline in a moral sense, but rather a shift in priorities from durability to immediate functionality. Religious and ceremonial spaces, however, continue to show relative stability compared to administrative and economic systems. Ritual continuity persists even in increasingly fragmented urban environments. This suggests that cultural identity remains one of the last cohesive elements of the civilization, maintaining shared meaning even as structural systems dissolve. Yet even here, variation increases over time. Regional differences in ritual practice become more pronounced. Some traditions are maintained faithfully, while others evolve or merge with incoming cultural influences. Over generations, this leads to a gradual divergence of identity across regions that were once unified. One of the most revealing patterns in this phase is the absence of coordinated recovery attempts. In earlier periods of stress, the civilization demonstrated the capacity to reorganize and stabilize systems. In this phase, responses are localized and fragmented. There is no evidence of a unified strategy to address the growing instability. This suggests that the administrative capacity required for large-scale coordination may already have been significantly weakened. The result is a system that continues to function, but without central direction. Cities manage their own crises, regions negotiate their own survival, populations adapt independently. The superpower, as a unified entity, no longer exists in practice, even if remnants of its administrative language persist. And yet, even as cohesion dissolves, certain structural patterns remain visible. Trade continues in reduced but persistent forms. Agricultural production stabilizes in localized pockets. Some regions maintain relative continuity longer than others. This uneven survival will later become crucial for archaeologists attempting to reconstruct the civilization's final structure. What is becoming increasingly clear is that collapse is not a single event, but a prolonged transition in which the boundaries between system and environment blur. The civilization is no longer clearly distinct from the surrounding populations and regions. It is becoming absorbed into the very instability it once managed. As migration continues, environmental stress persists, and administrative fragmentation deepens. The remaining structure of the superpower moves closer to a state where even its surviving centers can no longer maintain long-term continuity. And it is within this final phase of fragmentation that the most dramatic transformations begin to take shape, leading toward the complete disappearance of the system as a recognizable historical force. The cities do not fall in unison. They unravel one by one, each at its own pace, as if the civilization is being switched off in uneven stages rather than erased by a single force. In some urban centers, daily life continues almost normally until suddenly it does not. In others, decline is slow and visible, marked by thinning populations, reduced maintenance, and the gradual silence of once busy administrative quarters. What connects all of them is not timing, but direction. Everything is moving toward reduced complexity. At the height of this phase, the archaeological record becomes both richer and more confusing. Richer because more sites are abandoned in ways that preserve final moments of occupation. Confusing because each region tells a slightly different version of the end. There is no single collapse horizon. There is only a widening field of endings. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In the most stable cities, administrative activity continues longer than expected. Tablets are still produced, though in smaller quantities. Officials still record distributions, though with increasing gaps in data. There is a sense of persistence, but it is increasingly detached from the broader regional reality. These centres operate like islands of continuity in a sea of fragmentation. Elsewhere, abandonment is more direct. Houses are left with objects still in place. Storage rooms are sealed but never reopened. In some cases, valuable materials remain untouched, suggesting that departure was not driven by gradual economic migration alone, but by sudden decisions made under pressure. Yet even these abrupt departures do not always coincide across regions, reinforcing the idea that the system is breaking apart unevenly. One of the most important insights from this phase is the changing relationship between urban centres and their surrounding hinterlands. In earlier periods, cities functioned as organising hubs, drawing in resources from agricultural zones and redistributing goods outward through carefully managed networks. Now, that relationship begins to reverse or weaken. Hinterlands become self-sufficient or disconnected, while cities struggle to maintain their traditional role as central coordinators. This shift is visible in storage infrastructure. Granaries that once served multiple districts begin to fall out of use. Localised storage replaces centralised systems. Distribution becomes irregular and increasingly dependent on immediate proximity rather than long-distance planning. This is not just economic change, it is structural transformation of how space and authority are organised. Environmental pressure continues to act as a background force, but its effects are no longer uniform. Some regions experience severe agricultural collapse, while others maintain relative productivity. This uneven distribution of stability creates migration flows that are difficult to predict or control. Populations move not towards centres of power, but towards zones of temporary viability. In certain archaeological layers, there is evidence of repeated occupation cycles within the same structures. A building is used, abandoned, reoccupied by a different group, then abandoned again. These cycles suggest instability in settlement patterns and a lack of long-term confidence in any single location. Survival becomes more about flexibility than permanence. Administrative systems struggle to adapt to this fluidity. Records from this phase show increasing inconsistencies in population counts, resource allocations, and regional reporting. Some entries appear incomplete, others contradict earlier data. This does not necessarily indicate corruption or intentional distortion, but rather the breakdown of reliable information flow. Without consistent data, coordinated governance becomes increasingly difficult. As authority weakens, local leadership structures become more important. In some areas, power shifts to regional administrators or military figures who manage resources independently. In others, traditional elites maintain control through localized networks of influence. These parallel systems operate without overarching coordination, reinforcing fragmentation. At the same time, cultural continuity persists in unexpected ways. Even as political and economic structures dissolve, shared traditions remain visible across regions. Certain symbolic practices, architectural styles, and ritual behaviours continue, though often adapted to local conditions. This suggests that cultural memory outlives institutional frameworks, even as it becomes increasingly regionalised. However, the coherence of shared identity is gradually eroding. Differences between regions become more pronounced over time. Language usage diverges. Artistic styles evolve independently. Administrative terminology loses uniformity. What was once a shared civilizational identity begins to fracture into localized expressions. In some cities, there are attempts to restore order through re-centralization. New administrative centers are established. Efforts are made to reassert control over surrounding territories, but these attempts often lack the scale and coordination of earlier systems. They function as partial reconstructions rather than full restorations, and their influence rarely extends far beyond immediate regions. The absence of large-scale coordinated response is one of the defining features of this phase. Earlier in its history, the civilization demonstrated the ability to organize across vast distances, adjusting to crises through integrated systems. Now, responses are fragmented, delayed, and localized. The infrastructure of coordination still exists in places, but it no longer functions as a unified whole. Conflict does appear during this period, but it is not organized on an imperial scale. Instead, it is fragmented into smaller confrontations over resources, territory, and survival corridors. These conflicts leave traces in the archaeological record, but they do not form a single narrative of conquest or invasion. Rather, they reflect the pressures of a collapsing system where competition increases as coordination decreases. One of the more subtle but important indicators from this phase is the increasing variability in construction practices. In earlier periods, architecture followed standardized forms that reflected shared planning principles. Now, buildings vary widely even within the same region. Some structures are carefully built and maintained, while others are improvised and temporary. This reflects a loss of shared technical and institutional knowledge over time. As urban centres continue to decline, some are partially reoccupied by new populations. These groups often repurpose existing infrastructure rather than building entirely new settlements. This creates layered archaeological contexts where different cultural phases overlap within the same physical space. Over time, this layering becomes one of the primary challenges in reconstructing the original civilization's final phase. What is particularly striking is that even in decline, some systems persist longer than expected. Certain trade routes continue in reduced form, some agricultural zones remain productive, small pockets of administrative continuity survive in isolated areas. These remnants suggest that collapse is not uniform extinction, but selective survival under constrained conditions. However, these surviving elements are no longer connected in any meaningful way. They function independently, without coordination or shared governance. The superpower no longer exists as a system. It exists only as scattered fragments of former structure, each operating in isolation. By the end of this phase, the archaeological record no longer reflects a civilization in decline. It reflects a post-civilizational landscape emerging in real time. The structures remain, but the connections between them have disappeared. The system has dissolved into its components, and as the final layers begin to form, even these components will begin to fade from coherence, leaving only traces that later generations will struggle to interpret as part of a once integrated whole. There is a point in the archaeological record where disappearance no longer looks like an event, but like a change in the ability of a system to leave evidence behind. In this phase of the forgotten superpower, cities are still present in the landscape, yet their signals grow weaker. Not because they are suddenly gone, but because fewer actions are being recorded in durable forms. The civilization is still operating, but it is increasingly invisible to the methods that once captured its existence so clearly. The clay tablets that once formed the backbone of administrative memory become less frequent. Where earlier layers show dense clusters of record-keeping, this period shows scattered remnants. Some centres continue producing documentation, but the consistency is gone. In many cases, it appears that writing itself is being reserved for only the most essential transactions. Everything else is handled informally, orally, or not at all. What survives in the archaeological record is only a fraction of what once would have been routinely recorded. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. This shift has profound consequences for historical reconstruction. Civilizations are often defined not just by what they do, but by what they choose to record. Once that record weakens, the ability to reconstruct internal processes collapses long before the society itself disappears. In this case, the superpower is still functioning in reduced form, but its administrative voice is fading. Urban centres continue to exist, but their internal structure changes in ways that are increasingly visible in excavation. Large administrative complexes show signs of partial abandonment. Some rooms remain in use while others fall into disrepair within the same building. This uneven maintenance suggests that institutional cohesion is no longer operating at full scale. Responsibility is fragmented, and oversight is inconsistent. At the same time, household archaeology begins to show a different kind of adaptation. Domestic spaces become more central to economic and social activity. Craft production shifts into smaller units. Storage becomes localized. This reflects a broader transformation from centralized urban economies to household-based or neighborhood-based survival systems. The city is no longer functioning as a unified machine. It is becoming a collection of semi-independent units sharing the same space. In the surrounding regions, settlement patterns continue to fluctuate. Some sites show brief reoccupation phases, followed by abandonment. Others transition into entirely different cultural traditions without clear continuity. This creates a patchwork landscape where the identity of the original civilization is increasingly difficult to isolate. Instead of clear boundaries, there are overlapping zones of influence, adaptation, and replacement. One of the most important indicators from this phase is the disappearance of standardized administrative language. Earlier systems relied heavily on consistent formulas, titles, and accounting structures. Now, inscriptions become irregular and localized. Even when writing persists, it no longer reflects a unified bureaucratic system. Instead, it reflects regional adaptation, improvisation, and in some cases, fragmentation of literacy itself. This linguistic breakdown is more significant than it might appear. Shared administrative language is one of the key mechanisms that allows large systems to function across distance. When that shared language dissolves, coordination becomes exponentially more difficult. Even if political authority still exists in some form, its ability to communicate effectively is severely reduced. Environmental conditions continue to play a background role, but their effects are now filtered through already weakened systems. Agricultural variability persists, with some regions maintaining productivity while others struggle. Without centralized redistribution, these differences become more pronounced. Regions that once balanced each other through trade and coordination now develop independently, reinforcing divergence. At the same time, migration patterns become increasingly localized rather than regional. Instead of large population movements across the entire civilization, there are smaller, repeated shifts between nearby areas. People move toward more stable microregions rather than attempting long-distance relocation. This reflects a loss of confidence in large-scale systems and a focus on immediate survival environments. Archaeologically, this period is marked by increasing reuse of materials. Stones are taken from older structures and repurposed. Metal objects are melted down and reshaped. Entire buildings are dismantled to support new construction elsewhere. This recycling of material culture is not unusual in ancient collapse contexts, but here it is especially widespread. suggesting both resource scarcity and loss of centralized supply chains. In some regions, there are signs of deliberate preservation efforts. Certain structures appear to have been maintained longer than surrounding areas, possibly due to cultural or symbolic importance. Temples, in particular, sometimes remain active after administrative buildings have been abandoned. This suggests that ritual or religious identity continues to hold communities together, even as political and economic systems dissolve. However, even these enduring institutions begin to fragment over time. Ritual practices diverge between regions. Shared symbolic systems become localized interpretations. What was once a coherent religious or cultural framework begins to split into multiple variants, each reflecting the conditions and influences of its specific environment. One of the most striking aspects of this phase is the absence of large-scale rebuilding efforts. In earlier periods of stress, the civilization demonstrated a capacity to reorganize and reconstruct damaged systems. Here, that capacity appears diminished. Instead of rebuilding on a large scale, communities focus on maintaining what already exists or adapting abandoned structures for new purposes. This reflects a shift from expansion and restoration to preservation and improvisation. The weakening of administrative infrastructure also affects long-distance connectivity. Roads that once linked major urban centres fall into disrepair or are used only intermittently. Communication becomes slower and less reliable. Trade routes that once functioned as lifelines for the entire system shrink into regional pathways serving local needs. The network structure of the civilization effectively collapses into isolated clusters. In some cases, there is evidence that knowledge systems themselves are being lost. Technical skills that were once widely distributed become localized or disappear entirely. This includes aspects of construction, metallurgy, and administrative accounting. The loss is not necessarily sudden, but gradual, occurring over generations as institutional continuity breaks down. Despite this, certain elements of the civilization persist in modified forms. Architectural styles continue in simplified versions. Agricultural practices are adapted rather than abandoned. Even elements of governance survive in localized forms. These remnants indicate that collapse does not erase cultural systems entirely, but transforms them into smaller, less integrated versions of their former selves. By the end of this phase, civilization no longer exists as a coherent historical entity. What remains is a dispersed field of cultural and material fragments, each carrying partial memory of a system that once operated at scale. The connections that defined its identity have been severed, leaving behind isolated continuities rather than a unified structure. And as the final stage approaches, even these continuities begin to fade from the archaeological signal, leaving only traces that require reconstruction from silence rather than record. The silence does not arrive suddenly. It builds slowly, like sediment settling over a structure that is still technically there but no longer actively maintained. In the archaeological record of this forgotten superpower, there is a phase where cities are no longer clearly falling because there is nothing coherent left to fall. Instead, activity becomes so sparse, so uneven, that the difference between occupation and abandonment begins to blur. Some settlements still show signs of life, but it is a reduced and increasingly local form of existence. The scale is no longer regional or networked. It is immediate, confined, and reactive. Houses are repaired only when they fail. Storage is maintained only when it becomes necessary. Administrative action, where it still exists, is no longer systematic but situational. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. One of the most revealing aspects of this phase is how much of the material record depends on chance preservation. Earlier periods produced structured archives, sealed storage rooms, and standardized documentation. Now, the survival of information is accidental, a tablet left in a collapsed room, a seal impression preserved under debris, a building that burned in just the right way to preserve its contents instead of destroying them. The civilization is no longer actively recording itself. It is being recorded by accident. In many regions, the distinction between different cultural layers becomes increasingly difficult to define. Excavation reveals overlapping occupations with minimal separation between phases. This suggests rapid turnover of populations or continuous reuse of space without long-term planning. The idea of a city as a stable, continuous entity begins to break down. What remains are zones of repeated human presence rather than clearly bounded urban systems. At the same time, environmental reconstruction shows that variability continues, but its effects are now mediated through fragmented human systems. Agricultural production becomes localized to small, resilient pockets. These pockets are often isolated from one another, unable to exchange surplus or coordinate response. As a result, survival becomes uneven, even within relatively small geographic areas. One of the most important patterns in this phase is the disappearance of long-distance administrative coherence. Earlier systems relied on consistent communication across vast distances. Now, even nearby centres may operate independently without any evidence of coordination. This is not necessarily political rebellion. It is more consistent with the breakdown of communication infrastructure itself. Messages do not arrive. Instructions are not transmitted. The system does not reject authority. It simply no longer receives it. In some cases, evidence suggests that knowledge of previous administrative systems persists, but only in fragmentary form. Individuals or small groups continue to use outdated formulas or symbols, but without understanding their original function within a larger structure. This creates a kind of administrative echo, where the form of the system survives after the system itself has ceased to function. Material culture during this phase becomes increasingly simplified. Pottery, tools, and construction materials show reduced complexity. This does not necessarily indicate cultural regression in a moral sense, but rather the loss of specialized production networks. Without large-scale coordination, manufacturing becomes local, practical, and stripped of earlier standardization. Urban spaces also continue to transform. Large public buildings are repurposed into smaller functional units. Some become shelters, others become storage spaces or workshops. In many cases, the original purpose of the architecture is no longer relevant to its use. The city becomes a shell containing adaptive reuse rather than planned organization. Religious and ritual structures, however, often persist longer than other institutions. Even in heavily fragmented settlements, there is evidence of continued ceremonial activity. This persistence suggests that shared belief systems remain one of the last cohesive forces within a disintegrating society. Yet even here, continuity is not uniform. Ritual practices begin to diverge significantly between regions, reflecting localized adaptation rather than centralized tradition. One of the more subtle but important indicators of this phase is the reduction in large-scale construction altogether. Earlier periods show evidence of coordinated building projects, infrastructure maintenance, and urban planning. Now, such activity is rare. When construction does occur, it is small-scale, immediate, and often temporary. The ability to mobilize labor and resources over long distances appears to have diminished significantly. At the same time, migration continues, but in a very different form than earlier phases. Instead of large population shifts driven by regional collapse, movement becomes localized and repetitive. People move between nearby settlements based on short-term conditions such as food availability or security. These movements do not establish long-term settlement patterns, but instead create a fluid population distribution across the landscape. Archaeological evidence from this phase often shows mixed cultural deposits within the same site. Different material traditions coexist without clear dominance. This suggests that identity is no longer organized along centralized cultural lines, but is instead shaped by immediate context and interaction. The result is a highly heterogeneous cultural landscape. In some regions, there are indications that small-scale authority structures attempt to maintain order. These may take the form of local leaders, councils, or surviving administrative roles. However, their influence appears limited in scope and duration. Without broader connectivity, their ability to enforce decisions beyond immediate surroundings is minimal. Another significant development is the gradual loss of specialized skills. As institutional continuity breaks down, training systems disappear, knowledge that once required formal transmission begins to fade. This is visible in construction techniques, metallurgical practices, and even administrative literacy. Over time, this leads to simplification of technologies and reduced complexity in material production. Despite this decline, certain adaptive strategies emerge. Communities learn to operate within constraints rather than attempting to restore former systems. Resource sharing becomes more immediate and localized. Survival depends less on systemic coordination and more on flexibility within small groups. This represents a fundamental shift in how human systems organize themselves under prolonged stress. Environmental conditions continue to fluctuate, but their impact is now filtered through weakened human systems. Some regions recover temporarily, while others decline further. The lack of large-scale coordination means that these fluctuations are no longer balanced across the wider region. Instead, each area experiences its own trajectory of stability or decline. By this stage, the concept of a unified civilization is no longer archaeologically meaningful in functional terms. What remains is a dispersed collection of settlements, traditions, and material traces that no longer interact as a coherent system. The superpower exists only as memory embedded in fragmented evidence. Yet even this memory is unstable, because records are sparse, uneven, and often accidental. Later reconstruction depends heavily on interpretation. The absence of continuous documentation means that large portions of the civilization's final phase must be inferred rather than directly observed. What becomes increasingly clear is that disappearance is not a single point but a process of thinning. First, systems lose coordination. Then, they lose scale. Then, they lose continuity. Finally, they lose the ability to leave consistent traces behind. What remains is not a dramatic end, but a fading signal that eventually falls below the threshold of visibility. And as this signal weakens further, even the fragments that survived earlier phases begin to lose coherence, setting the stage for the final transition into historical obscurity. There is a strange quality to the final phase of disappearance, because it does not feel like destruction from the perspective of those living through it. It feels like continuation under reduced circumstances, like a world that has not ended but has quietly stopped expanding. In the remnants of this forgotten superpower, life persists in scattered pockets, but the idea of a shared system has already dissolved beyond recognition. Settlements still exist across the landscape, yet they no longer form a connected network. Each one operates according to local conditions, local memory, and increasingly local necessity. What once was a coordinated civilization spanning regions, climates, and economies has become a collection of isolated survivals, each adapting independently to a reality that no longer supports large-scale integration. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In the archaeological record, this phase is marked by a striking reduction in standardized forms of production. Pottery styles vary not only between regions, but within individual settlements. Toolmaking becomes increasingly dependent on available materials rather than inherited technique. Even construction methods begin to reflect immediate improvisation rather than established tradition. This is not simply decline in quality, but a structural shift in how knowledge is transmitted and applied. The loss of standardization has deeper implications than it might first appear. In earlier phases, uniformity allowed distant communities to operate within a shared system of understanding. Measurement, language, administrative procedure, and trade all depended on consistency. Once that consistency breaks down, coordination becomes nearly impossible even when physical contact still exists. In some regions, evidence suggests that people continue to use remnants of the old administrative system, but without full comprehension of its structure. Seal impressions appear without clear institutional context. Numerical systems are used inconsistently. Written symbols persist, but their meaning shifts across time and space. The civilization's former bureaucratic language becomes a set of disconnected fragments rather than a functioning system. At the same time, environmental pressures continue to influence settlement patterns, but now in a more indirect way. Without coordinated redistribution, communities are forced to respond individually to changing conditions. Some areas experience brief periods of recovery, while others enter prolonged decline. These fluctuations create a patchwork landscape of uneven survival, where stability exists only locally and temporarily. One of the most important developments in this phase is the disappearance of long-distance economic integration. Trade routes that once connected distant urban centres no longer function as structured systems. Instead, exchange becomes sporadic and informal. Goods move through chains of short interactions rather than organised networks. This fundamentally alters the scale at which society operates. Urban centres, where they still exist, lose their hierarchical structure. Administrative buildings no longer function as command centres. Instead, they are repurposed or abandoned in stages. Some become residential areas, others serve as storage or craft spaces. The clear separation between public and private, administrative and domestic, gradually dissolves. Religious and ritual continuity persists longer than most other systems, but even here, fragmentation becomes visible. Shared traditions split into localized variations. Symbols retain familiar forms but acquire different meanings depending on region. Ritual practice becomes increasingly tied to local identity rather than broader cultural unity. The sense of belonging shifts from civilization-wide to community-specific. In some cases, archaeological layers show repeated cycles of occupation and abandonment within the same site. A settlement is used for a period, partially abandoned, then reoccupied by a different group or generation. These cycles suggest that while the landscape remains attractive for habitation, long-term stability is no longer achievable. The reasons for abandonment vary, but often relate to resource depletion, security concerns, or environmental fluctuation. Another important feature of this phase is the increasing importance of mobility. Fixed urban centres lose their dominance as populations become more flexible in their movement. Rather than relying on permanent infrastructure, communities adapt by shifting locations based on immediate needs. This mobility reflects both necessity and adaptation, but it also contributes to the further breakdown of stable settlement systems. Administrative memory continues to degrade. Even where writing persists, it becomes less structured and more symbolic. Formal records give way to abbreviated notes or simplified inscriptions. The ability to maintain detailed bureaucratic documentation fades as the institutions that supported it disappear. Over time, literacy itself becomes unevenly distributed, concentrated in small groups or entirely absent in some regions. This loss of administrative continuity has profound consequences for historical visibility. Civilizations are preserved in history largely through their records. When those records diminish, the ability to reconstruct their internal structure becomes increasingly dependent on material culture alone. In this case, the written voice of the superpower fades before its physical traces disappear. Material culture during this phase reflects both continuity and adaptation. Some traditional forms persist, but often in simplified or modified versions. New hybrid forms emerge as different cultural groups interact within the same spaces. This creates a complex archaeological signature that is difficult to interpret as belonging to a single coherent tradition. In certain regions, there is evidence of attempted consolidation. Small-scale authorities try to re-establish order, sometimes by reusing older symbols of governance or reviving simplified administrative practices. However, these efforts appear limited in scope and duration. Without broader systemic support, they cannot restore the scale or coherence of earlier structures. What is particularly notable is the absence of large-scale reconstruction projects. Earlier in its history, this civilization demonstrated the ability to rebuild and reorganize on a significant scale after periods of disruption. In this final phase, that capacity is no longer visible. Instead, the focus shifts entirely towards short-term survival and localized adaptation. Environmental variability continues to shape outcomes, but its effects are now unevenly distributed across fragmented populations. Some areas manage to maintain agricultural productivity, while others experience persistent instability. Without redistribution networks, these differences become permanent rather than temporary. Over time, this contributes to further divergence between regions. By this stage, the civilization no longer functions as a unified system even in residual form. It exists as a scattered collection of communities that retain partial memories of shared structures but no longer operate within them. The concept of a superpower becomes archaeologically abstract, reconstructed only through comparison of fragments rather than observation of continuity. And yet, even in this deeply fragmented state, traces of the original system persist in unexpected ways. Architectural styles echo earlier designs, agricultural practices retain distant similarities, cultural motifs survive across regions in altered but recognizable forms. These remnants suggest that disappearance is never absolute. It is transformation stretched across time. As the final stages approach, even these residual connections begin to weaken further, leaving behind a landscape where the civilization is no longer present as a system, but only as scattered echoes embedded in the material world. At this stage, the civilization no longer fades in the way earlier decline phases suggested. Instead, it disperses into the landscape so thoroughly that even the idea of decline begins to lose meaning. What remains is not a system under strain, but a set of disconnected human realities occupying the same geography that once supported a unified superpower. The archaeological record reflects this transformation with increasing clarity. Continuity has been replaced by fragmentation so complete that reconstruction becomes an exercise in inference rather than observation. Settlements still appear across the region, but they no longer behave as parts of a coordinated network. Each one functions independently, shaped by local conditions and immediate needs. Some maintain modest stability for a time, while others appear briefly in the record before vanishing again. The sense of a shared civilization has been replaced by isolated survival systems that no longer reference a broader identity. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. One of the most important indicators of this phase is the near-complete collapse of administrative uniformity. In earlier periods, even as fragmentation began, there were still recognizable structural patterns in how information was recorded and systems were managed. Now, those patterns dissolve almost entirely. Inscriptions vary not only in content but in structure, format, and even in the basic logic of record keeping. What once was a shared bureaucratic language becomes a set of disconnected local practices. This transformation has deep consequences for how archaeologists interpret the final stages of the civilization. Without standardized systems, it becomes extremely difficult to distinguish between regional evolution and systemic collapse. A change in writing style might indicate cultural adaptation, or it might reflect the complete loss of institutional continuity. The ambiguity itself becomes part of the evidence. Material culture reflects the same fragmentation. Tools, pottery, and architectural remains no longer follow recognizable regional traditions. Instead, they show a high degree of improvisation and local adaptation. In some cases, older techniques are revived, suggesting partial cultural memory of earlier systems. In others, entirely new methods emerge, likely developed independently in response to immediate environmental or economic constraints. Urban structures during this phase show increasing irregularity. The distinction between planned cities and organic settlements begins to blur. Large-scale architectural coordination is absent. Instead, buildings are constructed, modified, and abandoned in cycles that reflect shifting population needs rather than centralized planning. The city, as a concept, no longer functions as a stable organizational unit. Despite this fragmentation, there are still traces of continuity embedded within the material record. Certain symbolic motifs persist across regions, though often in altered forms. These motifs suggest that while institutional memory has largely dissolved, cultural memory continues to exert influence. However, without shared systems to reinforce meaning, these symbols gradually lose their original coherence. Environmental conditions continue to vary, but their impact is now mediated entirely through localized systems. Without redistribution networks, each region responds independently to agricultural fluctuations. Some communities manage to stabilize production through adaptation and diversification, while others experience prolonged scarcity. The result is a highly uneven landscape of survival, where proximity does not guarantee similarity in conditions. Migration remains an important factor, but it no longer follows broad regional patterns. Instead, movement becomes highly localized and frequent. Populations shift between nearby settlements based on immediate resource availability. These movements create fluid demographic patterns that prevent long-term stabilization of any single site. One of the more striking developments in this phase is the disappearance of large-scale infrastructure maintenance. Roads that once connected major centers fall into disuse. Irrigation systems degrade without coordinated repair. Storage facilities collapse or are repurposed. This reflects not a single moment of abandonment, but a gradual loss of the capacity to maintain systems that require collective effort. In some regions, there is evidence of short-lived attempts to re-establish order. Small-scale authorities emerge, sometimes using remnants of earlier administrative symbols. These efforts appear to represent local responses to instability, rather than coordinated attempts to restore broader civilization-wide systems. They function within limited geographic boundaries and rarely persist beyond a few generations. Religious and ritual continuity shows a similar pattern of fragmentation. While some practices persist, they increasingly reflect local interpretation rather than shared tradition. Ritual spaces are maintained in some areas, abandoned in others, and repurposed elsewhere. The shared symbolic framework that once unified diverse populations becomes increasingly difficult to trace. In archaeological terms, this phase is characterized by what can be described as thin continuity. Elements of the original civilization remain visible, but they are no longer structurally connected. A pottery style in one region may resemble that of an earlier period, but it exists without the administrative or cultural system that once supported it. These remnants are echoes rather than active components of a functioning civilization. Another important feature of this phase is the loss of large-scale coordination memory. Even when physical infrastructure remains, the knowledge required to operate or maintain it declines. Irrigation systems are abandoned not necessarily because they are destroyed, but because the institutional knowledge required to sustain them is no longer present. This represents a form of collapse that is cognitive as much as material. As generations pass, the memory of the original superpower begins to fade even within surviving communities. Stories may persist, but they become localized, fragmented, and increasingly symbolic rather than historical. What was once administrative reality becomes cultural memory, and eventually myth. The transformation of structured history into narrative tradition marks one of the final stages of systemic dissolution. At the same time, environmental adaptation continues to shape human behavior. Communities develop strategies suited to local conditions, but these strategies are no longer shared or standardized. This leads to a diversification of survival methods across the landscape. Some groups rely on pastoral mobility, others on small-scale agriculture, and others on mixed subsistence strategies. The absence of coordination means that innovations are not widely transmitted. A successful adaptation in one region may remain isolated, never spreading beyond its immediate context. This limits the potential for large-scale recovery and reinforces fragmentation. By this stage, the civilization no longer exists in any meaningful structural sense. It survives only as a collection of independent human systems occupying the same geographic space that once supported a unified entity. The concept of a superpower becomes an archaeological reconstruction rather than a lived reality. And yet, even as coherence disappears, the landscape still bears the imprint of its former integration. Roads, ruins, agricultural modifications, and scattered material traces continue to suggest a past system that once operated at scale. These remnants form the basis for later attempts at reconstruction, long after the civilization itself has ceased to function. As the final phase approaches, even these traces begin to lose clarity, leaving behind a landscape where history must be assembled from fragments that no longer connect in any direct or continuous way. By the time the final phase begins, the civilization is no longer collapsing in any recognizable sense. Collapse implies a structure that still exists in some coherent form, even if it is breaking apart. What remains here is something more diffuse. The system has already dissolved. What follows is not the end of a living organism, but the fading of its last residual signals across a landscape that no longer recognizes it as a unified presence. Archaeological layers from this period are deceptively quiet. At first glance, they appear almost stable, as if human activity has simply stabilized at a lower intensity. But closer examination reveals something more unsettling. The continuity between sites is gone. The shared patterns that once defined a civilization-wide system no longer exist. Each settlement is now an isolated unit, disconnected not only from administration, but from cultural synchronization itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In earlier phases, even as fragmentation increased, there were still traces of recognizable coordination. Trade networks weakened but persisted. Administrative language degraded but remained partially standardized. Cultural motifs diverged but retained a shared foundation. In this final phase, even those residual connections disappear. What remains is not variation within a system, but the absence of system altogether. Settlements that continue to exist do so under entirely local logic. Their survival depends on immediate environmental conditions, short-term resource availability, and small-scale social organization. There is no longer any evidence of planning beyond the local horizon. Even memory of broad coordination appears to fade within a few generations. One of the most important indicators of this phase is the disappearance of long-distance material similarity. Earlier archaeological layers showed recognizable patterns across vast regions, consistent pottery styles, standardized weights, shared architectural principles. Now, those similarities break down completely. Material culture becomes entirely localized. Two settlements separated by only a short distance may produce entirely different technological and stylistic traditions, with no shared reference system. This fragmentation suggests not just the loss of communication, but the loss of shared cultural reference points. Without transmission, each community becomes a closed system, developing independently in response to its own conditions. Over time, this leads to a landscape of cultural isolation, where historical continuity can no longer be traced across space. Environmental adaptation continues, but it is now fully decoupled from any regional coordination. Some communities persist in agriculturally favourable zones, while others shift toward more mobile subsistence strategies. There is no longer any evidence of large-scale redistribution or resource balancing. Each group survives according to its own capacity, without structural support from a wider system. In this context, even migration loses its earlier meaning. Movement is no longer part of a broader pattern of population redistribution. Instead, it becomes episodic and reactive, driven by immediate necessity. People move because conditions force them to, not because a larger system organizes their relocation. The result is a constantly shifting but structurally unconnected population landscape. Administrative memory, where it still exists, becomes purely residual. Writing may persist in isolated contexts, but it no longer functions as a system of governance. Inscriptions become symbolic, fragmentary, or purely local in meaning. The bureaucratic structures that once gave writing its coherence have disappeared entirely. What remains is form without function. One of the most revealing aspects of this phase is the treatment of older structures. Buildings from earlier periods are no longer maintained with any sense of preservation or continuity. Instead, they are treated as material resources. Stones are removed, reused, or reconfigured without regard for original purpose. This recycling is not destructive in a symbolic sense. It is practical. It reflects a world in which historical continuity no longer holds functional value. In some cases, entire architectural complexes are reduced to raw material for new construction. Temples become foundations for dwellings. Administrative buildings are dismantled to support smaller, localized structures. This transformation erases not only physical architecture but also the spatial memory of earlier systems. Religious and ritual continuity, which have persisted longer than most other systems, also begins to fragment completely in this phase. Shared symbolic frameworks disappear. Ritual practices become highly localized or cease entirely in some regions. Without shared institutions to sustain them, even the most resilient cultural structures dissolve into isolated remnants. At the same time, there is no evidence of a unified catastrophic event that could explain this final dissolution. No widespread destruction layer, no singular horizon of collapse. Instead, the record shows gradual thinning until continuity itself becomes impossible to trace. This is not an ending marked by violence or sudden rupture, but by the exhaustion of connectivity over time. The disappearance of coherence has a profound effect on how later archaeology reconstructs this civilization. Without continuous records, interpretation must rely on scattered fragments that no longer clearly relate to one another. Each site becomes an isolated puzzle, and the larger picture must be inferred rather than directly observed. In some regions, there are faint indications that knowledge of earlier systems persists in distorted form. Certain construction techniques or symbolic references suggest residual cultural memory, but these are no longer part of a functioning system. They are echoes, detached from the structures that once gave them meaning. As time progresses, even these echoes fade. Later layers show increasing simplicity in material culture, reduced technological complexity, and minimal architectural investment. The landscape becomes populated by small, self-contained communities with no visible connection to the past system that once unified the region. What remains by the end of this phase is not a civilization in decline, but a post-civilizational environment. The structures of coordination, communication, and shared identity have fully dissolved. What persists is human presence, but without the framework that once organized it at scale. And yet, beneath this apparent emptiness, the physical traces of the superpower remain embedded in the landscape. Roads cut across regions that no longer use them. Ruins stand without memory. Modified soils and irrigation traces still shape agricultural potential. These remnants do not function as part of a system, but they preserve the outline of one that once existed. It is within these silent traces that later generations will attempt to reconstruct what was lost. But even for them, the civilization will never appear as a continuous entity. It will exist only as fragments assembled across time, space, and interpretation. As the final transition approaches, even these fragments begin to lose clarity, leaving behind a landscape where the past is no longer preserved as memory, but as scattered evidence waiting to be interpreted. What remains of the civilization at this point is no longer held together by any living structure. It survives only as a pattern embedded in the ground, in broken architecture, in soil layers that no longer correspond to a coherent human system. The superpower does not end with a final event. It ends with the loss of the ability to distinguish itself from everything that came after. In the archaeological record, this final phase is marked not by destruction, but by the absence of recognizable connection. Earlier layers could still be linked through shared systems of writing, trade, and material culture. Now, even those links dissolve. Each site stands alone, disconnected from any broader framework. The civilization can no longer be reconstructed from within. It must be inferred from fragments that no longer speak the same language in any literal or structural sense. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In many regions, occupation continues at a small scale, but it bears no visible relationship to the past superpower except in geography. New communities build on the ruins of older ones, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes with partial awareness of what came before. But even when awareness exists, it does not translate into continuity. The systems that once defined the civilization administration, trade networks, standardized communication no longer exist in any functional form to be inherited. One of the most striking aspects of this phase is how quickly the landscape loses historical legibility. Within a few generations, knowledge of previous structures becomes fragmented even among local populations. Oral traditions may preserve faint echoes, but they shift rapidly, adapting to new conditions and losing precision over time. What was once a structured civilization becomes narrative material, reshaped by memory rather than preserved by record. Archaeologically, this creates a sharp boundary between structured collapse and post-collapse occupation. Below this boundary, there is system, coherence, and recognizable organization. Above it, there is adaptation without continuity. The difference is not just technological or political, but epistemological. The way humans understand and record their world has fundamentally changed. Environmental traces remain visible, but they no longer correspond to organised management. Irrigation systems exist in broken segments. Agricultural modifications persist in the soil, but are no longer maintained. Roads continue to influence movement patterns, but they are no longer part of a coordinated infrastructure. The landscape still bears the imprint of the superpower, but that imprint no longer functions as a system. In some areas, later communities unknowingly reuse earlier infrastructure in ways that partially preserve its legacy. A road becomes a local pathway, a ruined storage facility becomes shelter, a former administrative centre becomes a settlement nucleus. But these uses are incidental, not systematic. The original purpose of these structures is no longer understood in any functional sense. This is where the idea of disappearance becomes more complex. The civilization does not vanish in a physical sense. It is still present in ruins, in modified landscapes, in residual material culture. What disappears is the ability to recognise those traces as belonging to a single coherent system. The superpower ceases to exist as a historical subject. Even the concept of scale is lost. Later societies may encounter fragments of its infrastructure, but without the connective framework, these fragments appear isolated, even inexplicable. A massive wall segment is just a wall. A standardised weight system is just a set of objects. A buried archive is just broken clay. The meaning that once connected these elements has been erased by time and fragmentation. One of the most important lessons from this final phase is that collapse is not equivalent to absence. Instead, it is a transformation of relationships. The physical components remain, but their connections dissolve. Without connection, there is no system. Without system, there is no civilization in the historical sense. This is why the forgotten superpower appears so enigmatic to modern archaeology. It is not missing. It is dispersed. Its structure exists only in reverse reconstruction, where fragments are assembled backward into a form that no longer exists in lived reality. Every reconstruction is therefore partial, interpretive, and dependent on the limits of surviving evidence. As excavation continues across multiple regions, patterns do emerge, but they are always incomplete. Trade networks can be partially mapped. Administrative practices can be partially reconstructed. Environmental pressures can be inferred with increasing precision, but the full coherence of the system remains just beyond reach, not because it was never there, but because it no longer exists in any continuous form. In the final analysis, what disappears is not the civilization itself, but its unity. The superpower ceases to function as a single historical actor and becomes instead a distributed field of evidence. Each piece carries meaning only in relation to others that are no longer present in the same context. And yet, this fragmentation does not diminish its significance. If anything, it deepens it. Because what the record ultimately reveals is not just the rise and fall of a powerful ancient system, but the fragile nature of coherence itself. Even the largest, most sophisticated civilizations depend on continuous connection between people, institutions, and environment. When that connection fails, nothing truly vanishes at once. It simply stops being whole. The landscape that remains is not empty. It is layered with memory that no longer knows itself. Roads still point towards cities that no longer function as cities. Walls still outline spaces that no longer hold the same meaning. Soil still carries the imprint of systems that once organised entire regions, but all of it now exists without integration. This is the final state of the ancient superpower, not destruction, not erasure, but disassembly so complete that only interpretation can reassemble its form. And even then, what is reconstructed is never the civilization itself, only an approximation built from fragments that survived the long silence. As the narrative closes, the most enduring image is not of collapse or catastrophe, but of distance. Distance between fragments, between memory and structure, between what once functioned as a unified system and what remains scattered across time. The ancient superpower does not end with disappearance. It ends with separation that becomes permanent.